Lecture 3, How to Negotiate for a Community. My name is David Lepofsky. This is the third in my lecture series on practical skills for social justice advocates. Welcome back. How on earth do you negotiate for a community? What platform do you speak from? I've been doing this for years, and I've kind of stumbled from experience to experience, and let me share with you what I've learned. First, let's talk about what starts it all. Well, social justice campaigns can start any number of kind of weird ways. It may just be that a few like-minded people get together, either because they read something in the news that they were angered by, or they just decided something new has got to be done. It may be that there's a planned launch event where a couple of existing organizations come together and said, let's build something new. That happened in British Columbia in the fall of 2015, when they decided, a couple of organizations decided to come together and said, let's launch a campaign for a provincial disability law. On the day that they all came together, they held a public forum, and this resulted in the establishment of an organization called Barrier Free British Columbia, one of those disability startups I talked about in the last video lecture. And it ultimately succeeded in winning the enactment of a British Columbia disabilities legislation. It might be that a single organization that exists already decides that they want to take action, and they just get going. Similarly, and least predictably, sometimes there's an external event that creates the movement. For example, and this is just such a weird story, in November of 1994, a very small group of people had been pushing for Ontario to pass a Disabilities Act, but really it wasn't a movement at all. A member of the legislature, Gary Lepofsky, a member of the government, in fact, he was a backbencher, but Canada's first, Western democracy's first ever deaf member of the legislature, decided to introduce a bill. It goes to a standing committee of the legislature for public hearings, and it's the start of those hearings that created the movement. In other words, it wasn't the movement that created the bill created the movement. Any number of unusual ways that these things can get started, but what do you do once we get started? First thing you got to do is figure out, if you're going to play a role as a social justice advocate, who you speak for. What is the organizational advocacy platform on which you will stand? Often you've got to create that new platform, whether from working with an existing organization or a combination of them, or by starting a new coalition or some sort of group like a disability startup to advocate for it. What are the options? Well, as I said before, there's the existing organization. In 1980, I wanted to advocate for an amendment to Canada's proposed Charter of Rights to include people with disabilities in its proposed equality clause. I was just one of many who wanted to advocate for that. No one's going to listen to me, a 23-year-old law student, on my own. I needed a platform. I approached the Canadian National Institute for the Blind. The story of that is in my memoir, Swimming Up Niagara Falls, which you can download for free. A second possibility is establishing a new organization, a disability startup. Another possibility is creating a coalition of existing organizations, maybe not a startup of its own, but just coming together for a single purpose. And it can evolve over time. it can end up being something that one person starts on their own, and then it builds into something that no one foresaw. In deciding what platform to use, there's several things that I encourage you to consider. One, is there an existing organization that's already on the record fighting for this? That might be the obvious place to start because nobody needs any convincing to get going. Another factor to consider is the importance of keeping your platform fluid. We're going to speak later about developing your platform, but you don't want to get too locked in too early. And your choice of platform could make a difference on that. Is there an organization that's ready to act on this that is stable, that's got that doesn't have internal fighting so that it's in a position to get active? Does it have capacity? Does it already have people on board who could do the work? You don't want an organization necessarily that is eager to assume all the responsibility but doesn't have the capacity to do the work unless you're going to be able to do it for them. Is it bereft of internal politics? Sometimes you'll find an organization may be stable, may have a lot of resources, but they've got some internal issues that just means they're not going to be able to take this kind of thing on effectively. How easy is it to get instructions? If you're going to play a leadership role, even if you're not acting as counsel, you need to be able to get instructions. You need to be able to talk to someone who is in a position, or an executive committee, or if it's a disability startup, a steering committee, who are in a position to actually make decisions. Otherwise, the platform will not be effective because you'll spend too much time running around just trying to figure out who can decide what. It's also important in looking whether you want to use an existing organization or build a new platform. Who has pre-existing credibility? It's very helpful to ally with people who've already got a name and reputation and potentially media contacts. If you don't, you build that from scratch. We'll talk about that. But still, it's helpful. The other issue to consider is who is in the position, what organizations to start the quickest. If it's an organization that is, or combination or coalition that already exists, but they're not prepared to get right to work on it because they've got too many other pressing priorities, then their other capacities might look good, but if you want to get moving fast, you don't want to have to wait for that kind of stuff. Now, let me step away from the social justice advocate role for a moment, and let's just compare the role of a lawyer starting on a case in a classical way. For one thing, you've got an identified client. You know who they are, they can give you instructions, and you get them to give you instructions, typically in writing, so that you know exactly what your mandate is. You, as a lawyer, are obliged to follow their instructions. You don't have any choice. And of course, there's a relationship of confidentiality between you, the lawyer, and your client. The contrast in this area, if you're a social justice advocate, even, pardon me, like me, if you happen to be a lawyer, but you're not playing the role of lawyer, you are not their lawyer, they are not your client. None of those preconditions exist. There is no sort of formal process of instructions giving in the rigid sense or the firm or specific sense as lawyers. You can get people giving you a go-ahead for something, but it doesn't have the same force as legal instructions for a lawyer. When I'm in this kind of role, doing this kind of advocacy, I may not know who all the people are in the community that I'm trying to speak for, or the organization. There may not be a formal membership structure. There may be no formal meetings at which there's a vote on an issue. The result of my activity in a leadership role, or yours, may not be something like a lawyer negotiating a settlement agreement or a consent order of a court. It may be much looser and less specific than that. Yet, with all of that seeming difference, I can and have negotiated for them and at times actually secured advantages or results for them. As an example of this, I talked in a prior lecture about the disability startup that I now chair, previously the Ontarians with Disabilities Act Committee that fought for the Disability Act that Ontario now has. It started in 1994 and wound up in 2005 when it was passed. And its successor, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance, which I now chair and which campaigns for its effective implementation. In both cases, these coalitions were unincorporated. They had no budget. They had, well, the AODA Alliance does not have a formal membership structure. We have supporters. The ODA committee before it did have a formal membership structure. Neither has a formal voting structure in the traditional sense, like an annual general meeting. Our strength in both cases is not the number of members you have, it's the number of supporters you have, the number of people who are prepared to add their voices to yours, take action, and result in response to your recommendations and encouragement. In this kind of unusual, weird structure, what have I been able to do? Our coalitions, our successful coalitions, not just me, but collectively, we've been able to secure election pledges from some or all political parties in Ontario elections, going back as far as 1995 and in every election since then. We have been able to secure pledges in writing to us from leadership candidates who are running for leader of their party, for at least some of Ontario's parties. We've actually had the party's election commitments or platforms on disability legislation embodied in letters to us. So if you want to know what their platform is, you don't look at their platform on this, you look at their letter actually to us. We've been able to submit briefs. If you go to the AODA Alliance website, aodaalliance.org/briefs, you can see lots of them. Submit them to government of different levels, committees of governments of different levels, and so on. We've been able to appear at legislative hearings federally and provincially. We've been able to get endorsements for things we're pressing for from other disability organizations. We've been quoted extensively in the media and quoted and endorsed or commented on the floor of the Ontario Legislature and the Parliament of Canada a number of times. We've been able to secure enactment of legislation, amendments to legislation, and so on. So how do you do this? If you don't have any of that formal structure, what bargaining power can you have? Well, the two things you've got, and I'm going to spend most of this lecture talking mostly just about one of them, but the two things you've got is if you've been able to establish a credible, compelling platform or list of requests, the things we want, and if you can establish enough common ground in support of it, then that becomes of itself a persuasive force. If people don't even understand the objectives, want to support them or whatever, then if government does something that's contrary to it, well, it's more likely that it's going to go by without much public outcry or opposition. If, on the other hand, a constituency has been brought together one way or another and able to marshal their voice behind a particular request or set of requests, then that itself has power behind it, has potential force. The second thing I've got when I'm playing an advocacy role is the one bargaining chip I have if I'm sitting down with politicians or senior government officials is on behalf of the coalition I lead, what position am I going to take on what the government's doing? My one bargaining chip is, if you do X, we'll come out in support of it. If you do Y, we'll come out against it. Now, you might think, well, who cares what you have to say? But if you've been able to marshal enough public support and media recognition, then that can become a persuasive tool. It becomes a persuasive tool for two reasons. If government thinks that your coalition is sufficiently credible, or your constituency, the organization you're speaking from, is sufficiently credible that others in the community, in this case in the disability community, will rely on it. Well, if this coalition says it's a good thing, we're prepared to support it. If they say it's a bad thing, we're going to be blasting it. That is something which, in the case of some politicians, not necessarily all of them, can have force. If they're trying to get something passed, if you say, well, if you do A, B, and C, we're going to endorse it. We're going to stand beside you and say this is a good step forward. That is something for which one can undertake negotiation. Similarly, the other kind of other side of that is negotiating over what you will or won't criticize. There are times when a proposal has been put forward that we're negotiating on, and there's certain things in it we like and certain other things in it we don't like. If the things we like are good enough and are compelling enough, and if we can move them enough in that direction, then I might say, look, we can't say that we accept all of this, but we could say it's all a good step forward, and I can undertake to not vigorously oppose a particular component in it that we don't like. And I've had this happen. You don't sell your principles out on this. If there's something we're not going to oppose, it's something because it's after forming a judgment that it doesn't really matter. And while it's not, it may not on paper look like what we want, an evaluation that it's just not that harmful. I'll give you an example. So in 2010 and 2011, we were negotiating with the Ontario government over what would be included in an information and communications accessibility standard under the Disabilities Act. This would be a regulation dealing, among other things, with requirements for website accessibility. We wanted strong standards, and the government was wrestling with how much they were going to mandate. Initially, they were going to go to a weak level. We pushed them to go to a higher level. They decided that they were going to go to the higher level except for certain businesses, which they would let stop at the weak level for an interim period. Now, objectively, I don't like that. Why should we require them to go to a higher level? But in negotiations, we found out from people who consult with business on digital accessibility that even if the regulation told businesses you could stay at a lower level for a while, and then later you got to go to a higher level, those consultants will tell those businesses, hey folks, if you're going to do a retrofit of your website, just go to the higher level. Save yourself the costs. So on its face, the regulation was inadequate, but the way it was going to play out in practice, the inadequacy wasn't going to hurt us at all. So I made it clear in the negotiations, if we got everything else we want, I was not going to make a big deal out of that, letting business go to a lower level for a short while. These are episode-specific analyses you got to do, but it's a practical way of negotiating not only what you're going to congratulate, but what you're not going to blast. Now, it may be that you would think that governments will want you in these negotiations to come out and say, hey, we approve everything you're doing and it's all wonderful. And there are times when what they're proposing isn't everything we want. Initially, I worried that in this kind of negotiation for a community or a constituency, that just saying it isn't everything we want would actually be harmful. And I worried the government would say, hey, well, that's not good enough. But I've since gone to government leaders and said, hey, folks, if we say this is a good step forward, but it's not everything we want, that may actually help the government, because there'll be others out there who will be wanting to blast the government. You're doing too much for these groups, and you're creating too many obligations for the obligated sectors. And if the government's in a position to turn back and say, no, we're not giving them everything they want here. They actually said, this is not everything we want. That could actually help the government balance its effort to appeal to us and to other sectors of society. It's a very nuanced approach to negotiations, but it can be effective. Now, okay, so if that's my bargaining chip, if you're starting out doing this kind of thing, whether it's with an existing coalition or a new coalition, if you're a social justice advocate, what do? Well, there are a number of steps when negotiating for a community. I'm going to describe them, but there is no mandatory sequence. I've done these in one sequence, and sometimes in a different sequence in another, and it's all depends on the people you're dealing with, the urgency of the issue, and your own kind of judgment call as you go. So it's not a simple checklist: do A, do B, do C. One major step is finding common ground. I mentioned that if you can establish common ground within a constituency, that could be a very powerful tool that underpins your efforts at bargaining or negotiating for a community. How do you do that? Well, note, I'm not saying find consensus. And why am I saying that? Consensus implies sort of some broad agreement on kind of everything or most things. That may literally not be what it means, but when people talk about forming consensus, it connotes this idea that, well, if anybody disagrees, we don't have consensus. My aim is more modest, and that is to find common ground. Can we find enough of an agenda that there is enough support of, that even if we aren't doing everything everybody wants, and even if there are other things on which our constituencies members may vigorously disagree with each other, we at least agree on enough that we can move forward. That's common ground. How do you do it? Step one, if you're a social justice advocate, is you've got to hear from the community or constituency. You've got to give people a chance to, in one way or other, whether it's a big or small context, to voice what's on their minds. And people will tend to describe them not in terms of social policy goals or legislative amendment preferences, but rather what's going wrong in their lives, what's the barrier they're facing, what's the problem they're facing. That's where people live, and that's the starting point of finding common ground. We need to, and one of the activities I've been involved in that was a helpful way of doing this, starting 3 decades ago, right when the Ontarians with Disabilities Act Committee was started, was we would hold town hall or public forum meetings, invite people in. Instead of speechifying at them for a long time, we'd give them a basic overview, and then we'd have people sit at tables and play, it's not a game, but an activity I called What's My Barrier? And we had everybody go around the table and simply describe disability barriers they've faced, or ones they've seen that other people face. And if it's people without disabilities, it could be them talking about barriers that they've seen other people face, or that they don't want to face, but that they know are out there. You have somebody scribe, write them all down, and this becomes an opportunity for everybody to essentially have a voice and share their views, and then collectively summarize it for the whole group. You will find these kind of activities will, on their face, unexpectedly lead people to start hearing from other people things that they didn't write down, but that actually do bother them. Now, it's huge temptation now to do this by just a web form or an email, please reply, and so on. And I've done that. But frankly, when you're building and looking for common ground, it is not the best way to go. People are buried in emails and requests to fill out forms. And if I answered every single one I ever got, I wouldn't have time to eat or do anything else. So it's really helpful if we can provide a public venue to do this. Now, I did it before we had Zoom. Now Zoom may be a helpful way to add on for people who can't get out to do things and be able to do it more quickly. But there is advantage of actually being in the company of other people when you do this. One of the things I learned the hard way, I wanted, when I started doing this advocacy, that I wanted to just send out an options paper. I knew people with disabilities thought there were barriers, so let's just send out a detailed options paper and give them choices. And people with more experience than me said, no, David, you're getting way too far ahead of yourself. Get people a chance to just get their minds around the barriers they face, and so we can start seeing how to start drawing those options out. Now, next thing I want to talk about, or topic I want to talk about, is common ground among whom? Who are we looking for common ground among? Finding your platform, that is to say your organizational platform, not your agenda for reform, but finding your platform for advocacy is absolutely critical to building common ground. In fact, the platform you choose, the organizational platform, the folks who will be kind of in the room and with whom we're going to be bringing minds together to look for common ground, in large part will dictate a lot of what the common ground will be. For example, when we formed the Ontarians with Disabilities Act Committee, the people who we brought together were people who thought we needed a Disabilities Act. Now, there are some people who didn't think so. And we said, that's democracy. You go deal with the issues that matter. But if you want to get involved with us, our basic thing is we all agree we need a new piece of legislation to address the barriers we face. And the beauty of doing that is you avoid what could be a very divisive debate before you even begin. People aren't all going to agree on everything, but at least if there's enough of a basis to get them in the room and get them going, that alone gets you a long way towards building the common ground platform you need, agenda you need. Another way of putting it is, my goal is not uniformity or unanimity. My goal is harmony. The danger of seeking unanimity, all for one and one for all, it sounds great, but what it means is that one person in the room who doesn't agree, and all of a sudden we don't have it, and then people have to worry about meeting that one person's needs, even though it could distract, it could delay, it could defeat what we're trying to do. I will never be able, and no coalition I am part of will ever be able to unite 2.9 million Ontarians with disabilities or over 8 million Canadians with disabilities. So the idea is get yourself to a point where you can get enough common ground that the people who are actually in your tent can quickly come behind it, and outside others within the broader population can immediately see themselves reflected in it, even if they're not involved. If you're going to engage in this activity, trying to build common ground, you need to know where people's kind of mind space is at, where their heads are at. One of the things I've learned through this kind of advocacy work is, and these are not brilliant insights by any stretch of the imagination, but for lots of people with disabilities, they are overloaded. They are at times overwhelmed by the many barriers they face. They're trying to get by, whether it's their education or their careers and their social life and their families. And they are facing these barriers, more barriers than they could list in any particular day. It's not unusual, not in all cases, but it's not unusual for at times for them to get angry, have a sense of hopelessness or despair. I'm not painting all people with disabilities who are always angry, hopeless, and full of despair, but when you're focusing their attention on these things, you got to be aware that it's important to be aware that this can be on their minds. Uh, you come along to them with an issue or a proposal, it may be pretty remote from them. It may be, if they're just battling to deal with getting a job, then coming and talking about accessibility legislation seems kind of remote and rarefied. Or if they're dealing with poverty and they can't actually feed their family, then some of this other stuff will seem a little bit, even though it could substantially help them, may not really resonate for them. And understandably so. There is, it is not unusual, I found, for people with disabilities and others to feel that they can't really make a difference. That why bother trying doing any of this advocacy? We're up against such an uphill battle that it's not worth trying. I can't make a difference. Um, Adding to that sense can be a sense that it's futile to deal with politicians because in some of their minds these politicians are self-serving, or they all lie, or they can't be trusted, or they all break their promises. I'm not editorializing on this. I understand where people are coming from, and whether or not it's my perception, I totally get it. Um, and and therefore it's important, if we're going to undertake any advocacy efforts, to try to bring them together and find common ground, then we need to accommodate and be alive to that. One of the things that I've found is one of the most important roles that we play as a social justice advocate is actually to remove that feeling of futility. The moment people get past the idea that there's nothing I can do that will possibly help, you can give people a sense of momentum and then give them a sense of enthusiasm that comes with that momentum. That's not, nobody's deluded. It's not like all of a sudden they think everyone's going to listen to them. But on the other hand, going from that sense of I can't do anything to I'm going to try doing this, and whether they listen, I'm on it, can be actually quite empowering, and can be very positive. We as social justice advocates, it's our role to give them the tools to be able to do that. Um, if you're going to do this within an organization, it's important to know the chemistry within the organization. You may be in a formal leadership role, and that's great. If not, you're going to have to figure out which leaders you need to persuade within an organization. And if that's the case, this is within the disability community. A theme I'm going to cover at a number of points in these lectures. You need to look to the difference between the formal leadership, the formal line of authority, and the informal authority structure. It may be that the person who's nominally in charge in the formal structure is not the one who's really calling the shots, not the one people really listen to. So it's important for you to be alive to who they are, and who is in the pivotal position to make a difference. For example, I was on a committee once where there was a real need to work together and develop common ground, but the chair of the committee didn't really see that there was a need and wasn't really doing it. They're a good person. It's just it wasn't within their sort of sense of what they were doing. And I was not the chair of the committee, but what I did was to propose that we set a priorities committee up. I offered to chair it. We canvassed the committee, came up with a bunch of ideas, and I worked with the chair and all the members to come up with those ideas. And we found common ground. So sometimes it isn't the formal leader who ends up taking on the role of actually steering the building common ground process. So let me give an illustration of a priority setting activity or a common ground seeking activity I engaged in. This was in my capacity as chair of the Special Education Advisory Committee of the Toronto District School Board. We were dealing with agenda items, meeting after meeting, some that came from the school board staff, some from individual members, some from me. But we reached a point where it was worthwhile for us to figure out where are we going to go from here? What are we going to focus on? And so what I did is I called a meeting, or I set an agenda item to brainstorm priorities. And the ground rules were I'm going to go around the room and let everybody just throw in or one or two, or even if they insist, three things you wish we would work on, and made it clear. And note the general, or note the wording of it. It's open-ended so that people don't worry about, which specific policy memorandum should we question or specific procedure. Just through the lens of the children whose needs we're trying to advocate for. Just tell us what areas you think we should be dealing with or trying to deal with. If you've got one that you think is really the big one, tell us. If you got a couple, tell us, and so on. And an emphasis is don't worry about the measure we're going to use to fix it. Talk about the goal. What's the problem or thing we need to change? Basic ground rule is for brainstorming is no debates. We're not going to debate whether one person's comments are right or wrong, or whether it's important or not, or whether they got it accurate or not. We want everybody to be able to just kind of do a brain dump on this. As they're going around the table, and of course notes are being taken to track this, I'm not just chairing the meeting. I'm not just saying who's going to speak next and thank you very much. I've got to be very actively listening, and I'm looking for common ground. If somebody says something and it sounds like it resonates compared to what somebody else said, or if we could combine the two together, I'd say, well, if I add what you said and that former person said, I think the point is really X. And if both of them say, yeah, that's right, then we're synthesizing. As we're doing it, people feel that they're getting a chance to actually reach into their hearts and tell us what matters to them. But they're also getting a chance to hear others think what the others are raising, and potentially be persuaded by them of the importance of the other points too that they might not have thought of. It actually educates and energizes around the table. I, as the chair, may do minor factual corrections, like if somebody just states that X happened on a certain date, I might correct the date, but I'm not going to get involved in, and much as I don't want others debating, I don't want to either. As I'm doing this, I'm using basic mediation principles. If you go read the book Getting to Yes on how to do effective mediation and negotiation. So I'm looking for where we can be building bridges and distilling things down. I'm also, in my head or in writing, I'm breaking down what I'm hearing into three piles. A pile of things that I think as I'm going, we've got pretty strong consensus, or I should say common ground pretty early. On the other extreme, things that just sound like they're off in left field, or it may be one person's issue, but nobody else is going to go with that, and it's very narrow. And then things in the middle ground. And then after I've done that, I can walk away from that list and sort of be in a much better position to sort of get a sense of where the group is at, or where the group can be, where the common ground is most likely to resonate. This is an art, not a science. As I'm doing it, I will look to dodge divisive issues. If there's something on which I know there's going to be a lot of controversy, it may be important, but I might say, look, that's an important thing, but let's defer that to another discussion because it's a big discussion and there is potential for a lot of division. But our aim here is to see where we can have some common ground that we can move on quickly. This is part of the exercise of always persuading everyone, always doing advocacy. As we're working together, as you're reflecting back on them, you're both echoing or reflecting what they're saying, but also trying to advocate to them in a way where they see how their views crystallize together. Let me just give you some examples of where I've seen common ground language used in a way that helps unite people. Not necessarily the go around the table site, but after you've heard from people and you're looking for the common ground to build around. A huge one that has been very important to me is coming up with the concept of crystallizing the ask into, we want a barrier-free society for people with disabilities. Now, before that, it was not unusual for people with disabilities to do advocacy in silos, blind people advocating for Braille where they needed, people who were deaf advocating for sign language, people in wheelchairs advocating for ramps, and also for the argument in favor of them to be put in terms of discrimination. Now, I fully agree that denying these things can constitute discrimination based on disability. There's no question. But what I wanted to look for was words that would bring people together, where they'd all sort of see themselves experiencing reflected in it. And the term barrier really did it. So the beauty of barrier as a concept is each of those people can see their experience reflected in it. If you're a person using a wheelchair and there's stairs, that's a barrier. If you're a deaf person and there's no sign language provided at a point or captioning where you need it, that's a barrier. If you're a blind person who doesn't read print and can read Braille and needs to read some important information and it's only available in print, that's a barrier. Across the spectrum, it became the term that would crystallize experience of people with all kinds of disabilities. That's why when we did the activity of what's my barrier, everybody in the room came in and found out that their own experience was crystallized or reflected in that term. It became the mirror in which they see their experience. And then turning the request into a barrier-free society, or some will say an accessible society, became a natural consequence of it. And it's a nice short expression you could use. The other reason it's compelling, well, there are two other reasons it's compelling. When you talk discrimination, and these barriers are discriminatory, but when you talk discrimination, you can get people's backs up. And we want to get people moving positively with us, not being defensive against us. If you say, well, we have a society full of discrimination against people with disabilities, there'll be some who are going to say, no, we don't. We've got people who care about their needs and blah, blah, blah. On the other hand, if you say, we have a society full of disability barriers, well, who's going to argue against that? It's omnipresent. The other thing is, barrier became a term that could also bridge the partisan divide. Nobody likes barriers. People with disabilities don't like barriers. If I can oversimplify, the right wing would argue that they're economically efficient, the left wing that they're socially unjust. I don't care why they don't like them, as long as they don't like them. So the term became a useful centerpiece of the advocacy activity, and it helped build common ground. When I would do a town hall in the 90s, I could steal from President Ronald Reagan in the 80s, had a thing. He used to do this thing at his political events. Do you feel like you are better off than you were 4 years ago? The crowd would chant, no. And do you think prices are lower than they were 4 years ago or whatever? And they'd all yell, no. Well, I could get in front of a group at one of these public forums where we did the What's My Bear, and I said, I could say, stealing from that script, who thinks people with disabilities face no barriers right now, right? Who thinks these barriers are all going to go away if we don't do something about it? Who thinks that it's okay to have to litigate against these barriers one at a time? Who thinks barriers are good for business, right? You can do this kind of thing. And all of a sudden you've got everybody kind of focusing their mind in a core direction, and it's central to building common ground. Once you've gone through this exercise, whether it's going around the table at the Special Education Advisory Committee meeting or the town hall type event, a next step can be creating a document that synthesizes the common ground. It's best to just try to write it in plain language, in simple terms, in terms that reflects what people have had to say. But, it may not include everything everybody said. So one of the things you do when you come up with a document like that, you draft it, you ask for feedback, but you also say, look, we're not saying these are the only issues that should matter to any of you. This is where we've got common ground. If anybody wants to add anything, we can discuss it. Or we strongly support people if they don't see a particular issue reflected there. We're not saying don't advocate. We're saying do. We want you to go out and advocate for it. Use our common ground as the platform that will be a jumping off point for your advocacy. For example, if I'm at the table at the Special Education Advisory Committee and somebody wants to present an issue that relates only to one disability group, I don't want, it may be appropriate for us to focus on it, but I do make it clear to the advocates for parents of children with that disability, it's important for you to push this yourself, not wait for us, because nobody should have a veto on the advocacy of anybody else. So I'll say, see what you can do on your own, and if not, let's see if we should be, what we can do working together. And that's a way of both working towards common ground, but also empowering people who may not see a particular issue reflected in that common ground. What are my criteria for what's in that list beyond what I said before? I want what's in my list to be realistic, so it doesn't look like it's so pie in the sky that it's kind of dreamland. I want to make sure it covers the diversity of people in our constituency. And another theme I use, and you'll hear this in these lectures and so many other contexts, I like writing things in terms that no one would want to be seen opposing. I wanted to, like, barrier-free society. Who's against a barrier? Who thinks people with disabilities should face barriers? I like to write in those terms because I want to grab the persuasion high ground, and that enables me to do it. I will read my document, my list, my suggestions, whatever the common grounds can be, through multiple lenses. How will it be seen through the eyes of our supporters or potential supporters, our constituency, or people we want to get to jump onto the high-speed train that we're trying to advance on? How will it be seen through the eyes of the government? That's not to say the government's all got to agree on all this, but I like coming forward with asks that the government is not going to want to be seen trying to say no to. They may want to change the channel, but I don't want to give them an easy out. I want it to read in a way that it speaks eloquently to, and persuasively to the media, where a journalist isn't going to just dismiss it as being kind of dreamland. I want to write it in terms that are nonpartisan. I don't embroil it in any of the partisanship between parties. That doesn't help us, and it would potentially hurt us in significant ways. I like what we propose to sound obvious. One that we've used any number of times is a call that unites many for government to commit not to create any new barriers against people with disabilities using public money. Now, think about that. Again, who would ever want to be in favor of using public money to create new barriers? Sounds remarkably stupid. And that call has the advantage that it engages the voting public who pay taxes, even if they're not involved with our issue. I don't want my money used to create new barriers against people with disabilities. That's stupid. I also like, where possible, to have my asks or my common ground proposals look like we're being reasonable middle of the road. If anything, that we could ask for more. I don't want to unilaterally not seek something we need, but if I can present it in a way where it looks balanced and it doesn't look not only pie in the sky, but sort of hard line, then that helps even more. Let me turn to another topic. In terms of building common ground, a recurring issue that people will have to deal with is, what do you do about internal conflict? And obviously, there's no magic solution, but let me offer a few ideas. First, if there are a few people who are strenuously opposed or divisive or conflictual, I think it's important for the social justice advocate to try to separately set up time to meet and talk with them. Hear them out, because it may be that their disagreement is more feeling left out than feeling that there's a substantive disagreement. It gives you a chance to explore whether this is mediation principles, whether there is a basis for common ground, or there just simply isn't. My sort of rule of thumb is that I use email for areas of agreement, and I use in-person interaction for dealing with conflict. If we agree we're going to go out, or I just want to go out for dinner, that's fine, working all that out. But if somebody's upset with me, or if there's a potential disagreement, especially on a policy thing, I want to talk to them. Email has several dangers associated with it, or risks, I should say. Email has no tone of voice. The same statement could be read with a tone of voice that's entirely welcoming or overwhelmingly hostile. And there is a real risk that if somebody is agitated, angry, untrusting, or whatever of you or of the group, and you write them to try to dissolve the problem through an email discussion, they may impute to your email a tone of voice that you didn't mean because they are frustrated. Way to deal with that, where you can, is on the phone or in person. A way to deal with conflict is also to try to proactively find ways to take the issue on which there is conflict and take it off the table. You're doing advocacy on disability in the schools. I can tell you there's a perennial debate about when students with disabilities should be educated in a segregated, separate special class, and when they should be in the mainstream class. I'm not going to get into that debate here. Got lots of views on it and tons of knowledge about it. But I find that if you're going to try to build common ground, you are at high risk that you're not going to build it on that. So one of the things to do is try to find ways to simply say, we could deal with that, but let's deal with that separately, not through this exercise. The other thing is, even where there's disagreement, let's focus on areas where even those who disagree might agree. So we can all agree, I would hope, that inclusion in the regular classroom doesn't just mean a physical place. You stick the student with a disability in a regular class without the supports they need and hope they sink or swim. It would mean including them in a regular class with the supports they need. People on all sides of the debate about inclusion, special classes, would agree on that. They also would agree about the importance of parents' voice in the choice. Another solution, if you have a situation of conflict, is to lay out an agenda or a platform or a position that includes a minority report. We have common ground about A, B, C, D, and E. There are some who also think we need E and F, and leave people free to advocate on that, recognizing it, but not excluding it, but not including it at the same time. Final thing I want to say about conflict is that sometimes conflict on these on where you're going can actually, and particularly on your asks, can work to tactical advantage. What do I mean? There are times you just aren't going to agree. I mean, there's times where you just may have within a constituency a component that just say, look, we just can't agree. And in which case, democracy and effective advocacy means saying to them, you know what, we can't agree, but God bless democracy, we think you should go and do your advocacy on this issue. And if the point of disagreement is they think you're not asking for enough and they want a lot more, you're in the position to then go to government and say, look, there are people asking for a lot more than we are. And so here we are, look at our platform or our asks as being reasonable. That is not only an effective thing to do from the perspective of dealing with the finding common ground, but also the earlier subject of that I covered of negotiating for a community. There are also times that the conflict actually can resolve in ways you least expect. I want to give you an example. In 2022, the federal government proposed legislation called the Canada Disability Benefit. It was to provide a new federal income support for impoverished people with disabilities, a supplement to provincial social assistance, purportedly to lift them out of poverty. Two strands of views emerged within the organized disability community. A number of organizations, my coalition was part of them, felt the bill was way too weak and we wanted to go for amendments. Other organizations wanted to just take the bill no matter how weak and don't amend it because there's a risk they feared that we could lose the legislation. I think they were being pressured by the federal government to go that way and that fear was created by that, but be that as it may. These two viewpoints were not going to get reconciled. And eventually the bill got passed. It was too weak by the House of Commons. It went to our unelected Senate. And there was a whole dispute between these two groups. Again, one group was going to the senator saying, just pass it, don't amend it. You're risking that we could lose the bill. And others, of which I was part, saying, no, please amend it. And again, we weren't going to bring these folks together. It wasn't going to happen. What happened, however, was we managed to get the Senate to pass some amendments. Then they had to go back to the House of Commons. The House of Commons in our system has to ratify any Senate amendments or they're not adopted. They don't become part of the law. Well, once the Senate finished making its amendments, both sides of this debate within the disability community suddenly had a shared goal. We want the bill passed. So what happened was some of us put together an open letter to the federal government saying, please, House of Commons, ratify the Senate amendments so the bill gets passed. We thought it was inadequate, but it's certainly better than losing the bill altogether. And those who had opposed us in the Senate saying don't amend it, they signed on to the open letter too, a number of them. So all of a sudden, these two adverse groups within the disability community that were feuding before a Senate committee are now united behind an open letter. This wasn't exclusively my idea by any stretch of the imagination. I don't want to leave the impression it was, but it's an intractable conflict that suddenly ended up evaporating at the end of the day at that point in the process. So creativity, unexpected twists and turns, that's just part of what we do. Now, in future, I want to talk to a bit about taking your platform or your ideas that we've got as common ground. And once you've got to crystallize them into some kind of statement or something you can work from, a next step will be to take a series of advocacy strategies. We'll deal with that in future lectures, but also writing a brief or some sort of formal position paper to the government. I'm going to talk more in a future lecture on how to write it, how to compose it. But I do want to talk about a common ground building strategy that I and my coalition have used for many years. And it's a bit weird. In fact, it's very weird. The normal rule would be to privately, quietly write a brief, circulate it among some, and then submit it to government. What we have done is instead, we write a draft brief. And I've written lots of these. In fact, they're on our website at aodafeedback.org. And you can see a number of them. And what we'll do is, first we ask for input from the community. Then we develop a draft brief. And it reads like the final brief, but it's not something we've finally decided on. What I will do is I'll draft it before I publicly post it. I'll send it to organizations that may have a strong interest in the content of it, or where there are people who I think might be prone to dispute or feel it's inadequate, to get their input before we make the draft brief public. We then post the brief on our website and email it out to all of our supporters, which can be thousands of people. And we'll publicly say, please give us input, send us your feedback. Now, what's weird about this is community groups, social justice advocacy groups, don't usually publicly air just a draft of what their position's going to be. But why not? There's several advantages to it. It shows that we're totally open to discussion. I have, in some cases, sent the draft to government and said, hey, are there any factual inaccuracies? And it said, we don't have any interest in saying anything that's inaccurate. Let us know. There are times government's gotten back to us publicly or privately and given us corrections. Other times they declined to do it. But it has an advantage that it makes our brief better. It has an advantage that we can also tell the media and anyone else, hey, we sent this to the government to see if they had any objections to what we were saying, and we didn't hear back. The other advantage of it is, you know that when you go public on anything, that the government is going to hopefully read it and analyze it and decide what the response is. If you wait till you finalize it to make it public, that just gives them more time to before they can look at it. Make it public as a draft. They got the heads up early. I've also at times sent this draft brief to the sector that we're advocating on. It might be educators in case of education work, or other organizations, say, hey, if we got anything wrong here? If there's anything wrong, just let us know. What I've found when you send these out for feedback is that people really do read them, and people really do send us in feedback. Sometimes it's substantive feedback, sometimes it's just telling us where there's typos, all of which are useful. My goal in writing it is I want to write it in terminology that is sufficiently persuasive that people reading it will say, hey, we couldn't have written this better ourselves. It says everything. I don't mean written it better. I couldn't make the case any better. It says what we want to say. When we finalize the brief, we take that feedback, see what the feedback is, make any tweaks that we need to do. But then we will post it, send it to government, and we will encourage people to both write the government and endorse it, and write the government, if there's anything we left out, write the government and say what other points you think they should be considering. This, in effect, amplifies everyone's voice. Here's an illustration of creating a process for building common ground that I used at the Toronto District School Board Special Education Advisory Committee with some success. Our power talking more about this in a future lecture, but our power is to make recommendations. And one thing is just send a line like, you should do better at X, but we in several areas have identified an area that we want to do a bunch of work on. And so what we've done is this. First, we invite the school board senior staff to brief us on a topic, whatever the issue is. And then we will, I'll invite our committee, when I was the chair, to go around the table and brainstorm. We've now heard what the staff have to say, and when the staff brief us on it, we can ask them questions or ask for follow-up or more information. But then we go around the table and say, hey, what do we think we should do? And I don't have any votes here or anything. I just sit back and listen. A straight brainstorming. And as a result of that process, we may ask for more information. But then if I think that there's enough of a common ground that we can go on, I will go away and draft a motion. And the motion will set out the background. Here's what the problem is. And then it'll list a series of recommendations. SEAC, Special Education Advisory Committee, recommends that the school board should do the following. And I'll use the same writing terms, principles I've given you before. I like to make it look self-evident and like who could be against this, and clear and plain language and not jargony and stuff. And written in a neutral way, not a sort of partisan or unduly argumentative way. Can't say I achieve this every time, but then bring it back to our committee at a future meeting and circulate the draft, not for a vote, but just to invite everybody to give their feedback. Is there anything that we've left out? Anything you want to change? Anything you'd like to add? Also invite written feedback, but by doing that, kind of like a legislative parliamentary second reading or something, it gives it a chance for people to sort of absorb it, think about it, whatever. Take the feedback, make changes, come back with a revised version, maybe do it a second time if you need to. And then by the time you bring it for a vote, should pass fairly quickly because you've actually dealt with all the concerns. Also, along the way, the way our committee works, the TDS, Toronto District School Board senior staff are in the room while we're doing this at a public meeting. And I may, or we may, ask the staff to comment on these. Is there anything, feedback you'd give? Is there things we're recommending that you think you can't do? And if so, tell us why. We can refine this. Is there anything that we're proposing that you're actually doing or you tried and it was a failure? If they provide that feedback, that's great. Sometimes, unfortunately, they don't. But ultimately, when we're done, we end up with a product that we have a substantial buy-in on, and people feel a real comfort level with, and that we can then use as a platform for advocacy. Let me offer just some reflections on when I'm negotiating for a community, what have I learned? In a lot of ways, it is similar to negotiating in a particular case when I'm a lawyer on a real life case. I, throughout all my activities, including this, applied to myself the standard of ethics that when I was a Crown lawyer, which for those outside Canada means a prosecutor, doing criminal appeals, the standards that were applied to us, which is a very high one. When I'm meeting with politicians or otherwise trying to advance these things, aside from just the usual, make the persuasive arguments, and we'll talk about all that later, I will at times tell them that I've got a ground rule for myself. I'm not going to quote you. Anything you say at this meeting, you're not asking me to be not quote you, but my view is your position is not what you tell me here. It's what your government puts in writing or says in the legislature. And I find that as soon as I say that, there's like a cloud lifts. There's a greater comfort level. Now I have to prove to them over time that they can trust me, and there's no reason they necessarily are going to believe me. But And I might even say, hey, don't worry, I'm not going to walk out of this meeting and tweet that you said blah, blah, blah. And I've done this because I want a freer and fuller discussion. It's very much like when you're trying to negotiate to settle a case as a lawyer, and you want it to be, as we say in the business, without prejudice or unquotable. If I'm making the case, I want to show them what we are doing is just good policy. In other words, whether or not we want it, you should want it. I want to show that I could ask for a lot more, that we are being measured in our asks. If it is helpful when trying to persuade, especially if they're in government, that you've got the opposition on side. At one level, you might figure, why do they care? The opposition's the opposition. But on the other hand, if they know that they're going to do something and that they are not going to get blasted by the opposition, that makes their life easier. And so if I've done my groundwork and if we've done our, not just me, if we've done our groundwork to avert that possibility, that is a helpful form of persuasion. Similarly, if you can find other sectors from the community that are supporting you, that can really help. When we wanted the provincial government to enact an education accessibility standard under the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, talk more about that in a later lecture, we reached out first to the teachers' unions and got them on side. So I'd be in a position, if I'm meeting with a minister or a premier, to say, look, you don't have to worry about the teachers' unions. They're on the front lines of delivering education, and they agree we want this and we need this. They're on our side. They're not going to come out against you. It's worthwhile trying to show also why it's good, not only as a matter of policy, what you're asking for, but why it's good politically. Now, again, we're nonpartisan. We're not trying to get anybody elected or defeated. But if you could show public opinion support for you or editorial support for you, whatever, they read the political tea leaves. They're driven by it. Politicians very much live in a world where there's not too many battles they can win. In fact, cabinet ministers often go day to day just putting out fires and dealing with the latest crises. It's helpful to try to present them with your proposals saying, this is one you could win. This is one when you're done, you can go home at the end of the day and say, hey, I made things better. And frankly, whether it's public servants or politicians, that is why they went into public life. And that can really help. Try to anticipate and head off opposition that you expect. If you're arguing for regulations that affect business, there's going to be a knee-jerk expectation, oh, this will be bad for business, they want fewer regulations. If you can show that your proposals will actually make business money, will make them more profitable, that would be very helpful. In the end, think it's important when you're trying to persuade them to get them to visualize in their mind's eye actually proposing or adopting and announcing what you're asking for. Let them think of that day when they get to make the announcement and see how it could look good on them. To some extent, depending on who I'm dealing with, you might end up actually offering wording that they could use. Walk into a minister's office and say, hey, can I write your speech? They're going to say, no, thank you. But on the other hand, if you lay out what could be said in support of it in a way that they might look at it and go, hey, we cut and paste this. I'd like to say this. This is part of visualizing in their mind's eye what they do. It's part of the persuasion of helping get them over the hurdles and willing to actually take the action. Finally, it's really helpful to build on the tactic I've expressed earlier about writing your proposals in words that people can't say no to. Even if you've got a politician who doesn't want to say yes for whatever reasons or is reluctant to, it's helpful to present something where they don't want to be seen as saying no. If they've been asked to do it, they don't want to be the one who has to stand up and say no, that it will look bad on them. So it's both persuading them of the value of doing it and the harm to them from their perspective if they don't do it. I try to tackle stereotypes about us, and there's several. There is a huge stereotype that anything you do for people with disabilities costs money, and costs a lot of money, and costs too much money, and it's the wrong time. Oh, don't you know the economy's bad? It's never the right time. Either we're in a recession, or we're going into a recession, or we just came out of a recession, or we're thinking about a recession. I've heard every one. I'm not stopped by that, but I try to get them off that and counteract them with the costs of not doing what we're seeking, that it's actually going to hurt society more and cost society more. A stereotype that pervades in government, politicians and some public servants, is this idea that there's this, think of this regulatory spectrum. At one end are businesses who never want to be regulated about anything. And on the other hand, people with disabilities or others who just want to regulate the hell out of everyone, no matter what. Who cares what it costs? Who cares what the consequences are? And some government or public officials or politicians think it's their role to sort of stand in the middle and protect folks from us. I try to break that stereotype. For example, there are times when business leaders have said, hey, we want regulations to tell us, we want to do accessibility, but tell us what we need to do. We'll do it if you tell us what we need to do. If you could frame legislation or proposals in that context, you could break that stereotype which may be in the politician's mind and working against you. Now, this is all within the frame of negotiating for a community where, as I said at the start of this talk, we are not in the traditional client-lawyer relationship at all. With these tips, let us now turn to how to develop your formal detailed position, how to come up with the actual options you want to come up with, and then how do we advocate for them? Stay tuned in upcoming lectures.